little bit of maybe a testimonial almost, right? He uses Attenborough as, he mentions him again. It's kind of like, a really gold standard, right? So again, he's got, a famous name here. And it says, can virtually take us inside an elephant's bottom, right? So one of the things that we look at when we look at ethos is tone, right? Does the author appear sincere, fair-minded, and knowledgeable? Is he morally, ethically likable, right? Is it appropriate language? That kind of stuff, right? And so there is a very comedic tone to this article. He is a comedian. We would probably expect that. But for people who are really pro-animals, that comedic tone might be offensive. I have a friend who is such a bleeding heart when it comes to animals. And I don't mean that in a bad way. She is so sweet. She cannot find humor in anything that, even mentioning animals being hunted, if you had a joke like that, she would not find it funny. So she would be quite put off by the humor here because she would find nothing humorous in this situation. And so humor is one of those ways that we present. It's a tone that we use for our articles. And humor is very hard to write because people differ so greatly on what they find humorous or what they think is appropriate to make jokes about. We're much more consistent in what we find tragic or serious than we do comedic. And so when you use humor, you're really taking a risk unless you're good at it and you really know your audience. And so I think the uses of humor here really kind of maybe hit a discordant tone. And so I think that's another thing that might be a negative in terms of his ethos, that he might lose credibility because he seems to be making fun of this in a way that, maybe not, considering the topic, right? Animals in prison, animals tortured, that kind of stuff. Probably not necessarily the best, right? So here in this first paragraph, we seem to have some logos, right? He says zoo in Cumbria, 500 animals dying. We can click this link, and again, when you click, excuse me, the cat is climbing up my back. If I make a noise, that's because the cat, this is Phineas. Where are you, Phineas? Yeah. Oh, now he's on the piano. Okay. You should always click links in an internet article. If we had an essay or a scholarly journal article, we're going to have a reference page at the end, right, that lists all of the sources that we use to put this article together. In magazines and newspapers in print, they use something called attribution. They don't use reference lists because they're, every little space is money, right? So they don't want to add a whole, so they use attribution where they'll say, according to the Harvard study in 2017 by such and such, right? So they'll kind of tell you that, and then you can go track it down if you want. But in internet articles, oftentimes we have links to the research if they're available online. So always click the link to see where it takes you. And this takes us to another Guardian article. So again, that is problematic. If you keep going to the same source for all of your research, then that looks like one note that if that source has a bias, and we know that this is left center, that again, that doesn't look good. So you need to spread out your research using different sources, not just, even if you have one author that's written 7 books and is the authority, if all you do is cite from that author in your paper, that looks bad, right? So here we do have this that tells us about this zoo. Well, actually, okay, it's going to make me register. It's free, but I didn't register. So again, if you look at it, the problem with this article in terms of really good logos is it just talks about the zoo in Cumbria. It does not mention if this is a systemic problem against in all zoos in the UK or the world. And so because of that, it is true. This did happen. This is a horrible, horrible zoo, right? However, he does not prove anywhere in his essay that enough zoos are like this that they're bad, right? And so this is a huge weakness in terms just of logos here. We do not have breadth and depth of resources, right? So when you're analyzing an issue, when you're making an argument, you have to have breadth and depth. Breadth means that you've covered enough, right? That you're using sources from a wide variety, but also that you've managed to cover all of the information that you say you're going to cover, that you had covered it completely. Depth means that you've got significant research. It's just not surface stuff. It's not trivial stuff. You've actually given us meaty kind of resources to support your case. Here, we do not have breadth. We do not have depth. And that is a huge failing. So right away, when I read this article, I can see that this has not got effective logos. Now, one of the things you have to realize in your essay is that determining if the use of logos is effective, or ethos or pathos, is different than analyzing if it's inappropriate, right? So if they're using fallacies, then that would be not only, that would not be necessarily ineffective, because somebody might use a fallacy or they might use propaganda in a way that's quite effective. People are going to buy it, but it's not appropriate. It's not ethical. Right? So what you're doing in your body paragraphs is you're just analyzing how effective is the logos that they use. So again, here it's just not sufficient. And so, you can point out several places that the kind of logos he uses does not really prove his case, right? And so another problem with logos, right? Remember, logos can also be things like examples from real life and personal anecdotes. He does give us both of those, right? So here is kind of an example from real life. It's kind of more of a typical one where he talks about, it surprises him that anybody thinks that we should have zoos at all. And so obviously he seems to be channeling his own experience, because he says animals always look miserable in captivity. If you don't believe me, visit a farm park. All right. And then he says, then he gives this kind of typical example of Jerry the goat. And then he also mentions going to SeaWorld, right? So these are examples of personal anecdotes where he has himself experienced this. An example from real life is when he gives us this about Cecil the lion being killed, right? So again, and here we have the dolphin show, which again is another example, but also of his own personal experience. The problem with this is, again, it's just his personal experience. He does not then tie this to any in-depth examples that we can see to see that there's a strong pattern of abuse or trauma from animals, right? He also is what we call anthropomorphizing animals, right? So anthropomorphizing is basically when we give human characteristics to things that are not human. They can be animals, they can be cars, right? So they can be an inanimate object, but they can be animals, right? Just because a goat looks miserable does not mean that it is miserable, right? So if we look at images of goats, they don't necessarily look really happy, right? Some do, like, that looks like her, but a goat kind of looks just, strange. So how do we know that that goat actually was pleading to be euthanized, right? And again, think about that. Like, that would gives the animal the capacity to even think about wanting to be put down, right? So this guy is giving us a lot of this emotional, right? So this is actually where we have an example, but it's really acting more as pathos in a way that's inappropriate, because it is not logical to assume that you can look at an animal, if you're not an expert, and understand what that animal's expression means, right? And goats scream. So if you're just listening to the way they sound like they're being tortured, right? But they're not. That's just their natural voice. So every example that he gives here of these animals suffering from his own personal experience, there's really no evidence to say that he understands. Like he says, the dolphins look depressed. Really, right? So again, very, very poor logos, right? And most of it is being used in a way that's much more based on appeal to emotion. It is used in a propaganda fashion. Now, I can take that, one of your paragraphs has to purely be about propaganda or fallacy apparent in the essay, right? And so I can talk about the appeal to emotion in that paragraph and bring up all the different ways that he uses ethos, pathos, and logos for this propaganda that actually is inappropriate because it's not based on any kind of real truth, right? He doesn't give us any evidence that this is true, right? Here's another link. So if we look at the context of this sentence, zoos exist so that we can wander around with our children and